Good evening, everyone. And I say good evening advisedly because I know for I think it was Kathleen on the West Coast in Vancouver, it's of course late afternoon, and in Northern California, where another of you are from, it's also late afternoon. But here in downtown, deep dark downtown Toronto, where your presenter and myself, your host Tim Grant, are sitting, it is dark. And but wherever you're from, a warm welcome. And I think you're in for a real treat, as I said to those who joined us earlier. Um, uh, Kathleen Watt is our presenter. She and I have been chatting back and forth along with some of the participants while we've been waiting for the clock to strike the right moment. And I'm going to introduce Kathleen in just a few moments, but let me give you a sense of where we're going first. Those of you who've been part of one of our Green Teacher webinars know that that the presenter will speak for 20 to 30 minutes, and then she will take your questions for that same length of time. But you don't have to wait 30 minutes to ask a question of Kathleen, or let me know that you're having some technical difficulties if indeed you are. The place to do both is in the chat box. And if you haven't opened up the chat box, I'd encourage you to take your cursor and bring it down to the bottom of the screen, and that'll expose a black toolbar for you and one of the options is chat. Click that, it'll pop open a window which you can then drag off to the side. My chat box is just sitting underneath the picture of Kathleen's webcam, as I said earlier, and so that I'm able to see her presentation when she starts clicking through her slides in a moment. Those of you at the end of the 60 minutes I'll ask your indulgence to fill out a short evaluation. There's a Survey Monkey link that you'll see on Kathleen's last slide, and I will send that out to everybody tomorrow, along with some wonderful resources and a resource list that Kathleen has provided me. And we'll add to that resource list any of the additional resources that any of you mention in the chat box and over the next 60 minutes. This webinar is being hosted by Green Teacher. It's in fact co-hosted by EcoSpark, and Kathleen's going to tell you a little bit about EcoSpark. If you're not familiar with Green Teacher, Kathleen, I'll get you to move the slide here for us. We're a nonprofit magazine. I've been co-editing this magazine and editing it for the last 25 years, and it's a place where youth educators, whether they teach in schools or elsewhere, share their best ideas for educating kids from ages 5 to 19. And over the last 10 years, we've also had the pleasure of producing a number of books, and if you can advance that slide to Kathleen, you'll see our most recent one, teaching teens about climate change, in the upper middle there. And I was boring everybody before we started this webinar that we're just about to release a book called Teaching Kids About Climate Change for Strategies for Working with Kids at a Younger Stage. And I mention our books and our magazine only to say that if you're not yet a subscriber to our nonprofit magazine or haven't purchased any of our books, you would be doing us not just a great favor to do either, but by doing either, you'd enable us to continue offering this series of webinars for free. These webinars have been promoted by many organizations, and on the next slide, you'll see our American partners. If you're in a state with any one of these organizations, I'd encourage you to check them out. They're great organizations, and we really appreciate the work they've done in promoting this webinar. And on the next slide, our Canadian partners, and ditto, do check them out if you are not yet familiar and you live in a province or are interested in any of these national organizations mentioned there. Okay, just before I introduce Kathleen, one more thing. At the very end, I mentioned there will be a survey, but I didn't say that those of you who indulge me in filling out that survey will be eligible to win one of 2 free one-year subscriptions to Green Teacher. So, Kathleen Watt, some of you have already heard, you've been part of the conversation just prior to our hitting the record button, but she's a terrific education consultant who works with an organization called EcoSpark here in Toronto. It's an organization that has influence well beyond Toronto. It's an environmental nonprofit that started not too many years ago. It evolved from another organization that was located here, and it's broadened its mission when it emerged as EcoSpark. I've been following its progress over the years and known many of its staff members, and have always been singularly impressed with the variety of programs that they developed. And as in general, they're a profit and they're very focused on educating teachers and students to become stewards of the environment. Kathleen Watt herself has completed a Bachelor of Education, a Master's in Geography. No surprise, your geographic background shines through in this presentation, Kathleen. And clearly, as you'll get a sense very quickly from her, she's very passionate about environmental protection and land use policy. And indeed, we're going to see that writ large in her presentation. So settle in, Kathleen. I'm so delighted that you were willing to do this session with us, and it's over to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that introduction and for allowing us to do a webinar with you. We're very excited. So today's webinar is called Building Complete Communities, and we're very glad to have you with us today. Just a quick overview of our presentation. I'll talk a little bit about EcoSpark. We'll also go over a case study of the Greenbelt in Southern Ontario, and we'll go over what building complete communities really means and how we can apply that. We'll hopefully give you quite a few classroom activities and ideas that you can use both inside and outside of the classroom, as well as resources, and as Tim mentioned, time for questions at the end and an evaluation that we can go through.
And Kathleen, could I just jump back in?
All right, so what I'd like to start off with is just getting to know you, finding out a little bit about you. Oh, yeah. Hello.
No, that's great, Kathleen. Yeah, I was just going to say, please do, as Kathleen was just leading into, do tell us, everyone, if you haven't already in the chat box, you can see some have already. Tell us where you're from and what involvement you have had already about building complete communities. And Kathleen's got a couple more questions for you on the screen.
Sure, yeah, so absolutely. If you haven't already, let us know what town or city you're from, and province or state if you're not from this area. And let us know if, we might not have heard of your communities. If we haven't, maybe let us know if it's a rural or an urban area. And then if you have any experience with building complete personally or in your education, working with youth perhaps, in an educational setting or otherwise, let us know a little bit about you and your experiences. Great, so Carol, glad to have you with us from a rural community, wonderful, in New Hampshire. So it's great how they can be applied in rural as well as urban settings too. So Kristen, it's great to have you with us. Wonderful, from BC, great, out of Victoria, wonderful, lovely little island, so great to have you with us. Becca from London, an urban area, okay, good to know, yes. Tim from Toronto, great. Yeah. Oklahoma, definitely an urban area, yes. Denver, Colorado, an urban area, so thanks for joining us, Mallory. Wonderful, and it looks like a lot of people have experience with in education settings too, and even if you don't, we're still glad to have you with us today. Alaska, that's great. Oh, fantastic. Lots of based in both an urban area and rural areas. So that's great. What I want you to do is just kind of think about how these ideas of complete communities might apply to you in your urban or rural community as well. Wonderful, fantastic. So I think we're just going to keep going, but feel free to keep typing those answers. We love hearing from where you're from. All right, and I'm going to start off by talking briefly about EcoSpark and what we do. We are an environmental charity, so we're a nonprofit, and our goal is to primarily educate teachers and educators, and the aim is that you can then teach students and youth about the environment, and the hope is that they will eventually become scientists and stewards and eventually advocates for the environment, really working towards environmental protection. So that's what we typically do. We try and run a lot of workshops for educators and teachers, primarily environmentally based workshops. We also go into classrooms and do presentations and work with students. We sometimes have programs where we go into streams and we look at water quality monitoring, which is really fun. We get to put on big hip waders, which is always fun to do. A lot of computer-based programs. So we have quite a range, and I've been with EcoSpark for about a year and a half since I graduated from my master's a year and a half ago, and I really love how environmentally focused it is. And again, working with youth. As Tim mentioned, I used to be a teacher, and it's nice still having that connection to students, but again, with that environmental focus. And Carol asked, how do we get to see the chat? So if you're wondering about how to send your messages to everyone and not just the panelists, there should actually be a little drop-down menu that says to, right above the chat box option. It should say to, and if you click on that, there's a drop-down menu and you can choose all panelists and attendees. And that should make it so that you can send your comments to everyone. And you can read everyone's comments too.
Yeah, actually, thank you. Just Kathleen, I'll just add that if you've entered late, you're only going to see the comments that are, one limitation is that if you've entered late, you're only going to see the comments that are added after you've joined. So unfortunately, but there'll be more, so don't worry.
Well, thanks for letting us know about that, Tim. Okay, now we're just going to get started, and this might be review for a lot of you. You probably already know this, but I just wanted to reiterate the importance of protecting our natural environment. So natural systems, green space, forested areas, wetlands. It's really important to protect these since they help to provide water and habitats for animals. They also help to reduce the impacts of climate change by storing and sequestering that carbon dioxide. So it is really important to protect those natural systems and natural areas. It's also important to protect agricultural land. It provides a lot of food for our community, and it's something that can often be threatened, so it is important to protect that as well. And urban sprawl, it's that word that we've all heard of before. This is a phenomenon that happens throughout North America. You see it pretty much in many places where there's a lot of natural spaces, forested areas, green space, and it's often converted into residential development. The same thing can happen to agricultural land too. Agricultural land can easily become developed into residential development. That's something that, again, you can see across North America, and we really want to reduce that. And I'm going to tell you a quick case study about this area called the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And if you aren't familiar with this term, if you look at the image, it kind of looks like a sideways horseshoe, so that's how it got its name. But it's in southern Ontario, and you can see it's quite a large area. Actually, it's from Niagara all the way up to Toronto and Northumberland. So it's a very large area in southern Ontario. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take you through a little bit of the development that's occurred in the Greater Toronto area. That's just a smaller section within that Greater Golden Horseshoe. And I'd like you to focus your eyes onto where it says the City of Toronto. And I'm going to show you development that's taken place. It's a very light color gray, so focus your eyes on that and you can see where development has occurred. And there was, again, a lot of urban development in 1971 that took place in this area. So if you see that gray, slight gray area around the City of Toronto, that was already developed land. But in the 1970s, there was a development boom where a lot of residential development took place, a lot of agricultural land and forests were cleared for residential development. I'm just going to take you through a series of images that shows that development taking place. So this is an image from 1971. This is 1981, 1991. There's more development that occurred. 2001, 2011, even more development, and 2016. This is where we are right now. That's all the urban development that's taken place in this area, which is quite a lot. And if you think about lands that had to be converted to accommodate that growing development. Now, in the Greater Golden Horseshoe area, kind of the economic center of Ontario here, and it has a growing population. So in 2011, it was 8.7 million people, but that's expected to go up to 13.5 million people by the year 2040. That's a lot of residents that we have moving to this area. And what we have to make sure that we're doing is growing in a sustainable way. That kind of growth that was taking place in the images of the map is not sustainable. We can't keep doing that type of growth. So what happened was the provincial government in Ontario actually created a series of pieces of legislation, land use policies, to help protect this area from urban development. So they created the Niagara Escarpment Plan, the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan, and the Greenbelt Plan. And these are plans to help protect this area from residential development. So you can see all those green areas, those 3 different green colors show the different pieces of legislation. And the goal is that they work together to help protect this area from urban development. And the aim is to protect agricultural land as well as natural systems and green space and forested areas. And the main question is, how can we grow in a sustainable way? Hi, Becca. Yes, we can see your reply. Yeah. Okay, so yes, the main question is, how can we grow in a sustainable way? And the answer is to build complete communities. And we're going to talk about that right now. But complete communities are really designed for individuals of all ages and income levels, and they're really meant to be inclusive of everyone and try and promote sustainable growth. So we're going to talk about some of these ideas right now. The first is high density mixed use, mixed land use. If you look in this image, you can see on the first floor there's a lot of shops. You know, maybe the second floor might have some office space, and the third and fourth floor might be apartment buildings, so residential. And it's great to have that mixed land use because it helps provide higher density development, so we're building upwards instead of outwards to help preserve that agricultural land and green space. That's really what we want to encourage. It also helps to foster that sense of community. You can just go downstairs to grab a coffee with your friend easily. And it also helps to reduce your commute if you can work right in your community. Transportation is another thing that we want to keep in mind in the communities. We want to have a lot of walkable cities and active transportation, active where you're moving your body, so things like walking, cycling. So if we can have bike share programs or cycling lanes, and again, cycling lanes that are safe for residents to use as well. So if they have dividers or some way of actually separating people from the cars, that's often the best way. Public transportation too, things like buses, trains. And also promote electric and hybrid vehicles and alternative forms of energy. These are really what we're trying to aim for in the future development. Okay. We also want to encourage green infrastructure. This is kind of a buzzword right now. You might have heard of it before, but it really means development that includes the natural environment. So trying to incorporate the natural environment into our built environment. So if you look at the images, you can see that that looks like it used to be a really large sidewalk. It definitely didn't need to be that large. So what's happened is a lot of that pavement has been taken up and some green space has been put in. So a little bit of grass, maybe some trees. That's really useful for a couple of reasons. It allows water to kind of percolate down into the soil, which helps to reduce flooding and also helps to recharge your water tables. So it's really important. Other forms of green infrastructure include community gardens, maybe a rooftop garden, which is a great use of space that would otherwise be wasted. If you look at that image on the left, wouldn't it be great if our parking lots looked green like that? They weren't all black and full of asphalt and get really hot in the summer. So that's a really great way of promoting green infrastructure so that water has a place to go. We can also use things like clean energy and renewable energy sources. So solar panels, wind turbines, those are really what we want to encourage. Geothermal energy too. And we have a comment from Darren. All this would include complete streets as well. Correct. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we want to try and think about how we're designing our streets, our roads as well, and our sidewalks too. So it's all working together. So thanks for that, Darren. We also want to preserve our natural systems in agriculture. They can often be overlooked, and once they're paved over, they're gone. We've lost, the nutrient-dense soil and a lot of that biodiversity. So we really want to protect them before it's developed. and arts and culture. It's always wonderful if we have these right in our own community. It's nice if you can, go see a play or go to a cultural festival right down the street. You don't have to necessarily drive in your car and go all the way to a big city. So it's nice if we can have those right within our communities. It helps to create that sense of community too. And I'm going to show you an image right now. I'd like you to, in the chat box, you can let me know, do you think this is an example of a complete community? Just in the chat box right now. Is this an example of a complete community, and how could it become more sustainable? So kind of take a look and let us know what you think. Do you think that this is a complete community? Perhaps not. Maybe you think that there are some aspects that are working. So Darren, I don't see any bicycles. Absolutely. That's something that could definitely be improved. Looks like there's some active transportation, some people walking, but we don't see any bicycles or cycling lanes or anything. So Mallory sees people walking, so that's great. Yes, you're right. And there is some green infrastructure, like a rooftop garden and street trees. So good for noticing those too. You're right. The building could definitely be a little bit taller. And one thing about complete communities too is we want to also include a range in housing options and a range in building types too. So we can have some mid-level buildings and some high-rise buildings. So we have a little bit of option for residents. And Becca says, no, it doesn't. It's probably, oh, sorry.
No, she's responding.
Sorry, misreading the comments here. But there's definitely things that could be improved in this image. Office space, for example. Areas to have children too, that's right. So a couple of different things we could work on. All right, now I'm gonna give you a couple of classroom ideas that you can use both inside of a classroom with students or in other educational settings too. And so when it says classroom idea, you don't have to take it very literally. You can adjust these ideas as you see fit for your own experience. But primarily, the key question is, how could you make your community or your school into a complete community? There's a whole bunch of things that you can think about: land use, buildings, energy, transportation, natural systems, and again, trying to make it personal and really make that local connection. That's a great way of engaging students and helping them really understand the concepts, but also, again, making a personal connection so they retain that information and really find it interesting. There's a whole bunch of ideas that you can go through with students. Sorry, I don't know if you see that. Right, there you go. Okay, so there could be things like recycling or composting programs. Your school might also already have this, and if they do, that's great. Maybe they aren't using it very much though, so you can kind of encourage that. Tree planting is a great way to encourage students to, think about the natural environment and make a change. Things like de-paving areas as well. As I mentioned, if there's a lot of sidewalk, you can take that up. LED and motion activated light, great way of trying to, reduce the amount of electricity that we use. Green walls and plants inside. I'm going to show you a really great example of how a school actually made a green wall inside their school, and it's a really cool idea. So I'll show you that in a second. Community gardens are a great way of, talking to students about a couple of different issues. You can talk about science and how plants grow. You can talk about nutrition. You can have, healthy herbs and vegetables in your garden so you can actually cook with them. So there's many different topics that you can cover with that. Green roofs and solar panels, walking or a cycling month or club. For example, you can pair an older student up with a younger student if they live close by and they can walk or cycle to school together. It's a great way of kind of building that sense of community right within your own school too. And even bike lanes, and again, making sure that bike lanes leading to the school are very safe and that they have other ideas. Absolutely, pollinator garden, thank you. And if anyone else thinks of any other ideas about how you can make your school or community into a complete community, feel free to type those in the chat box. We love your suggestions.
Kathleen, I'm just going to jump in here.
Sure.
It's Tim here again. I just, for those of you who are trying to, there's an option in the chat box that says send to the panelists. And of course, the panelists are just Kathleen and myself. You want to look at, there's another option that says all panelists and attendees. And if you click that, that should enable you to see everyone's comments. I fear at the moment only Kathleen and I are able to see everyone's comments, and it would be great if all of you could see everyone's comments. So that might help for those who are having trouble. Sorry, Kathleen, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. All right. Another idea that you can do is actually go outside. Sounds so easy, but we often forget is just take your class outside. It's great to, engage with their natural environment. It kind of freshens students and wakes them up a little bit. And it's wonderful to, again, make those local connections to your own community. Students can think about their own lives and the house that they live in and how it relates to complete communities. You can even research examples of complete communities around your school or around your neighborhood or municipality and see if you have any close by. All right. Okay, another classroom idea is you can actually have students design their own complete community. So they could work in groups perhaps, and they can actually design and draw their own complete community, thinking about some of these ideas that we just talked about. So these are some images from the communities that I did with students. And as you can see, they kind of design it and draw it out. And it's wonderful to see some of the ideas they come up with. They can be really creative and, how they use their land and the space in their communities. One other thing I'd like to mention too is think about how you present this material to students or the youth. Students are usually used to the type of community that they live in, and they tend to think about those communities because that's what they know. So it's great if you can show them a couple of options of different communities built in different ways. For example, you show them a community that's built more in a grid pattern with streets that go north and south and east and west. You can maybe show them communities that are built perhaps more of a European style with kind of a city center, and then community that kind of builds outwards in that circle format. There's all kinds of different options you can choose. You can show students. Again, showing them a variety helps to encourage their creative juices going. All right, another idea, if you want to actually take that designing option and take it to the next level, is you can actually have your students build their own model complete community. And students can, you can really take this and make a whole unit or quite a large unit on this actually. And you can talk about math and financial literacy. You can build in measurement and budgeting skills. They might have to write a budget proposal, for example. You can talk about it in your art classes, and you can work on design, designing of buildings and things. You can encourage students to perhaps make a 30-second commercial and a presentation about this. And it's a really great way to kind of bring together what you've learned and make it a really fun project that spans several different areas of the curriculum. And again, you can adjust this as well. So if you're teaching, younger students or older students, you can adjust the material and the requirements so it doesn't have to be specific to one grade. Another idea is to actually have students research a type of green infrastructure. As I said, that's kind of the new key word right now. It's a buzzword, and not everyone necessarily knows what it means. So if you have students that are a little bit older, you might want to have them research a type of green infrastructure, such as bioswales. What does that really mean? You can look at that image. That's an example of bioswale, like a slope that allows water to kind of percolate down. You talk about, green roofs and urban architecture, urban agriculture. These are some of the ideas, and you can have students look at the impacts of climate change, maybe the impacts on a community or the economy. And again, you can kind of adjust your expectations based on the age level of students. Another idea that you can do with students at pretty much any grade level is work on a persuasive letter or a letter. And you can have students try and write a letter to a local government representative or perhaps the principal of your school. You can have students make a practical suggestion or a change that you can make within your school or community to try and make it more of a complete community. We've actually had students do this with some really great results. For example, one teacher I talked to said that she actually had her students write a persuasive letter to their principal. The principal actually was persuaded and gave them $500 to design and put in a garden at the front of their school. So these are ideas that you can actually do, and your students will have a great connection. It's something that they're probably going to remember for quite a while because they had a real impact. Every time they look at your school, they're going to see that garden and think about how they made that change. So it's a great way to motivate students and really get them involved. Now another idea, as I just mentioned, a school initiative is you can have a garden. So I just said that there were students that actually did build their own garden within their school. And this is an organization, Imagine a Garden in Every School. And that's just one organization. There's probably quite a few out there within your own municipality or state or province that has some similar initiative. You can look into those. And so Becca's just asked me to kind of clarify complete community. So complete community is, yes, absolutely. And there's different terms for it. Sustainable community, sustainable development. Complete community really just refers to a community that is designed to be inclusive of everyone and incorporate quite a lot of sustainable building practices. Sometimes these terms are also a little bit politically motivated, so perhaps you know it as like smart growth, for example. Complete community is kind of the term that we use and promote here. So that's kind of the word that we're using right now. So thanks for that question, Becca. There's also the idea of, I think Depave Paradise was another organization that did a webinar with Green Teacher. And so that's where I first learned about depaving. And you can, again, kind of encourage your students to maybe write a letter to your principal. And there's some pavement area. Perhaps you have a lot of asphalt on your school property, and maybe you want to create a garden or something. You can do that, and I'm sure, again, there's probably lots of organizations around that can help you with that too. Now, I mentioned that there was a school that tried to green their school a little bit, and this is an idea that you can have your students do. And again, you can write a letter to your principal, maybe get a teacher involved, or if you are the teacher, maybe encourage other teachers and students to work with you. But this is a great example. It's from a school called Milliken Mills in Markham, which is in Ontario, and they actually created their own green wall, and the teachers helped the students work together. And if you look, there's some of that black felt is actually made of recycled plastic water bottles, so it's a very sustainable source of felt for that. And they built this giant green wall. You can see there's actually a video I've included the link to, and they've got a lot of explanations about how they did it. It's a really great video. And if you look in the image on the right, there's actually a clear tube at the very bottom there. And that clear tube allows them to irrigate water up through the plants. It's a great way of problem solving and learning about how plants grow as well. And for example, there was actually a lot of water that was dripping down at first, so then the students created the idea of having herbs underneath to absorb that water. So it's a really great initiative that you can do with your students or other other areas too that help create that complete community and, again, green infrastructure. There's other school initiatives too, for example, solar panels. I think more than 250 schools in Toronto have solar roofs, so your school might already. And if not, perhaps you can try and encourage that a little bit. You can also have your students look at land use policies that are right within your own community. And might not be right within your own city, but it might be somewhere else in your state. So you can research these together and talk a little bit about those. You can also have your students talk about the role of stakeholders in creating that legislation. So they can always, look into the role of residents and farmers and developers, and maybe how they would have different perspectives on particular land use as well. And you can also have a stakeholder debate, and this is really fun. You might want to do this with students that are a little bit older. Again, you can adjust your expectations, but you can discuss a land use conflict. There's, conflicting land use. Maybe there's a space of land that is currently agricultural, and maybe some developers would like to put housing there. You can have students take on the point of view of various stakeholders and have a debate about what should happen to that piece of land. Again, it's great if you can choose a local example. And also talk a lot about the impact of development on biodiversity and the environment. So it's a lot of science connections here too. There's a couple other online mapping programs that you can use too. You might be familiar with Esri. They're ArcGIS, so it's an online mapping program. And they have a couple of different platforms. There's one platform that's more of a desktop version where you need a licensing agreement. That one sometimes takes a little bit longer to learn as a teacher. I think they also have a new online free mapping program website. So you can go, I think it's listed right there, and you don't have to write down the resources. Tim will send you an email after that has a list of all these resources. But you can go online and look at some types of land use right within your own community. And you can use that for free online. There's also another mapping program called the NextGeo, and that one focuses specifically on the Greater Golden Horseshoe region. So that's within Southern Ontario. It's got a lot of land use policies, some specific demographic information. So if you're within the Greater Golden Horseshoe area, you can use the NextGeo. If you're from another municipality, perhaps you could use the Esri ArcGIS. And Lauren asked if we can have the access to the presentation afterwards. Absolutely, I'm happy to provide that. So you don't have to worry about writing everything down, we'll provide it afterwards. Another idea is you can have your students look at green belts around the world. There's green belts all over the world. They sometimes have different purposes or goals. Sometimes they're the same. For example, urban growth boundary in Portland, Oregon, it actually is more of a kind of like a circle drawn around urban area. Development isn't supposed to expand that. And there's the European green belt, for example, which is throughout Europe. And that one's very unique because it actually spans several different European countries. And where there was the Iron Curtain, it was growing, and when the wall came down, then there was a lot of vegetation in that area. So to protect it, they created the European green belt. And so that's another example that you can look at. You can also have your students actually write a letter to government and maybe suggest improvements to your current land use policies. And you can cite examples from other green belts all over the world. So that's a really fun idea. Again, perhaps maybe for slightly older individuals. And the final idea is a Shark Tank idea. And initially this was a Dragon's Den idea, but Shark Tank's what's really popular on TV right now. You can encourage your students to, or your youth that you work with, to think of an environmentally friendly project. And maybe it's using recycled materials, but they should try and create an idea and maybe a pitch that they pitch to the shark. And the shark would be you as the educator. And you can maybe include an idea, and you can really get them involved. Again, you can scale this as large or as small as you'd like an assignment to be, and really adjust it based on the grade and expectations. But you can work again on math and budget proposals, sales pitches. You can have them write a 30-second commercial or something for the idea. So really a lot that you could do that. And it's really fun too, because it deals with something that's kind of current in the media right now. Now, we have a couple of additional resources, and if you know any additional resources that talk about sustainable development or complete communities, feel free to add those into the chat box. But one idea that we have is actually the Growing in the Greater Golden Horseshoe Teacher Resource Guide. We created this at EcoSpark last year, and it talks a little bit about the Greater Golden Horseshoe area, but it also talks about building complete communities, climate change. It's got a lot of background ideas in here and information. We also have a lot of videos and legislation and links that you can download. We also have this available in French too, so you can access that by going to our EcoSpark website, www.ecospark.ca/completecommunities. Oh, wonderful, and Darren's adding some additional excellent information about Niagara, so thank you very much. There's also lesson plans that we created at EcoSpark that talk about sustainable development, building complete communities. So you can download all those for free from our website as well. And again, you can adjust them. Just because it says grade 7 doesn't mean it necessarily is limited to that. So feel free to adjust the material and play around with it. And subject matters as well. If it's geography or science, often the lesson plans are very interdisciplinary. And I have a question from Jennifer. I saw the word video on the resource list. Does EcoSpark have any information available, such as videos that can show students in class? Great question, Jennifer. Thank you. So we do have some videos that we created. They aren't posted just yet, but we've recorded 3 other webinars that we've done. And so we will be posting our webinars along with the PowerPoint presentations. The webinars are probably a little bit long and not quite something that you'd want to show your students specifically, unless there's, maybe just the complete community section that you'd want to maybe show them. We currently don't have any videos per se, but we have a list of videos that are helpful. So in our resource guide, right here, we have a link to quite a few other videos that are useful and you can use in your classroom. So that kind of gives you a jumping off point. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking. And again, Derek has some other links as well, so thank you. And again, these are just some information about the lesson plans that we have. And there are a couple of other classroom resources, for example, Learning for a Sustainable Future, Young People's Trust for the Environment, Ontario Eco Schools. These are some ideas, and if you have any, feel free to throw them into the chat box. And again, Tim will be sending a list of all these around to you. Okay, now we're just about finished. What I'd like you to let us know is, what did you learn that you can actually take with you and use? So what did you learn today that you can actually take with you and use either in your professional life, in your personal life, or maybe in a classroom working with students or in an alternative education setting? So what did you learn today that you can actually use with you? So you can let us know in the chat box. And if you have any, sorry, just a couple final thoughts. Sustainable development is really important, again, for protecting our natural environment and agricultural land. It helps reduce climate change, which is definitely a pressing concern right now. So complete communities is really a great way to help build and support that. And we also have, again, quite a few resources I mentioned. And I think I mentioned a second ago that we have a couple of other webinars that we've hosted. So Building Complete Communities, Greater Golden Horseshoe, which focuses specifically on the area, the Greater Golden Horseshoe. We also have one that talks about teaching climate change, and another one that deals with mapping with the Neptus GeoWeb. So those are available. We will provide them, I think, on our website or on our YouTube channel. So stay tuned, and we'll send the link around once we've uploaded them. The PowerPoint presentations will be available as well. Great, and Seaver, I'm glad that you found the resources useful and good.
Great.
Victoria, glad that you got some ideas that you can use for your classroom. But I'd just like to leave you with just a food for thought almost. You don't have to write your answer, but just kind of thinking about what can you do right now to make a change in your community, to make it a complete community. And there might be some challenges, but we can all do something to try and improve it. So just food for thought. I'd also like to thank the Provincial Government of Ontario for their support, as well as the Neptus Foundation. And I'd like to thank you for joining us as well today. So there is a webinar evaluation that you can complete. It's at www.surveymonkey.com/r/MKTLMQN. So you can go ahead and complete.
Well, it's not quite yet, Kathleen. We want to give them a chance to ask some questions first. But
sorry, not just yet.
Yeah, no, but that's great. I'm glad you mentioned it, and because I often, as the host, forget even to mention it at the end. So you're getting ahead of us, but that's all good.
Okay.
And by the way, I just wanted to so folks, this is a chance for you to ask Kathleen questions. As you can see, she's got considerable expertise. I really love the variety of activities that you presented to us a few moments ago, and want to kind of go back to them in a minute. But this is the time, everyone, for you to type into the chat box any questions you have for Kathleen. I know I've already got a couple to ask her from what I've just heard, but this is your opportunity, and please type in a question and hit enter on your keyboard, and so that we can all see it, and I will make sure that if Kathleen doesn't see it, that it gets asked of her and your question gets answered. A slide or two back, Kathleen, and you don't need to go back, but you made reference to the connection between complete communities and climate change. It helps to reduce climate change, and it's sort of implied in lots of ways, but do you want to sort of speak to that directly?
Sure, absolutely. Complete communities really help reduce climate change in many different ways. Kind of in their whole format, actually. It's directing development to existing urban areas, which helps to protect green space, forested areas, wetlands, and those help act as carbon sinks. So natural resources, forest trees, they sequester, they store carbon dioxide, so it's not released into the atmosphere. So that's really important to protect. Complete communities also, they focus on green energy, so things like solar panels. For example, you can have a street light, and then there can be a little solar panel right on the side of it to help power that. So we're reducing the, using clean energy sources. There can also be, green infrastructure. So we're including more green spaces right within our cities and our urban areas. There's something called the urban heat island effect, and you might have heard of that, where cities and urban areas tend to be a lot hotter than rural communities and forested areas and green spaces. That's because those trees and green space really help to keep the heat down, and it provides other services. So that's the great use. It also allows a lot of water to drain down, so it helps to mitigate, reduce the impacts of climate change. I know right here it's snowy outside, maybe not today, but in winter we get a lot of snow here in Toronto, and that snow, when it melts, the water has to go somewhere. There can be a lot of flooding if there's a lot of pavement, because water doesn't go into concrete. So if we have more permeable surfaces, more green space, then that really allows the water to flow down, and again helps to reduce the impacts of climate change too. So thanks for that. I see quite a few questions here. Maybe I should go up and try and answer them.
The one person, Kathleen, I want to go back to your one of the activities that lit me up a little bit was the Shark Tank.
Sure.
One. And can you think of examples of schools, some of the ideas that activity has generated in the work you've done in schools?
Sure. For example, students could create a perhaps primarily using a lot of recycled materials as well, but maybe they could create a different type of car, for example, that maybe has solar panels on the top and uses alternative energies. So something like that, and they can go forward with a company name and a logo, and even you can encourage your students to really research these. And it's great because you can have group activities, and you can you can try and delegate tasks to students. So for example, students can kind of have maybe a business manager, and they can delegate roles within their group to really take ownership of it. Maybe someone works on the sales pitch and someone works on the budget proposal. Students really come up with a lot of really creative ideas, maybe even a system of implementing green walls throughout schools, and maybe they want to start a company that does that. So it's all kinds of ideas that they can do. And again, Shark Tank's a really fun show to watch, and students will really make a good connection to that idea.
Great.
It's a way of making a project fun, so it doesn't seem like work the same way.
And that's what caught my attention when you first mentioned it. Darren was asking a question, or making a comment really, and you're familiar with this too, Kathleen, as a former teacher and working with teachers now. But one of the challenges of doing field trips to get out into the community, of course, is the insurance coverage, the liabilities that are associated. Our colleague from the Toronto Catholic District School Board, and I don't know your first name, I'm sorry, Caprarl, I will say, suggests things like developing food garden in a box projects. But any thoughts about that challenge of insurance coverage and liabilities?
Sure. I'm not. Well, again, permission forms are really, something that we encourage, and you have to use if you're going on a field trip anywhere. In terms of insurance coverage, I'm not specifically familiar, to be honest, about that. But how can it be made easier? Really, if you can encourage, talk to your principal, or whoever it is that your supervisor is, maybe try and talk about the idea and the benefits. And, again, encouraging a lot of if you're actually taking a field trip and going somewhere, maybe encouraging, other adults to join in to help for that reason. I'd say permission forms are just a big thing. But I'm sorry, I'm not very familiar with insurance, to be honest.
That's a great answer. But you also, I thought you had another wonderful activity earlier, where you showed the whole idea of kids building model community, making models of what they think is a complete community, stuff they can do in school, or they can do at a community center if that's where the program is that's looking at complete communities. So I think you've already given us some really good ideas. And yeah, you want to call, if you're in a school, a formal setting where the restrictions are greater, call the curriculum coordinator, speak to the principal, find someone at the board office, the school board office, who can really help you navigate the difficulties. But that's great. Other questions? Are we seeing? Yep, selling the ideas. That's true.
I'm seeing some questions. Just having a hard time keeping up with them. Sorry.
Another question that was asked, I heard before I figured out that how to allow everybody to speak to everyone, something I should have clued in on a little bit earlier. But someone asked a question about ArcGIS and how to use those and other online, mapping platforms in classrooms. Do you have any tips about that, Kathleen?
Oh, sure, absolutely. There's a couple of different options based on where you are. If you're within the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the Neptis GeoWeb is very easy to use, and you can kind of log right in, and that's got a lot of land use policy specific to this area. If you're from another community and that doesn't apply to you, then ArcGIS is a great way, Esri. And as I mentioned, they have two different platforms. One is more of a desktop version, and that often requires a licensing agreement with your school board, and you can go through that way. It's a little bit more of a learning curve. I took a GIS class in my master's, and it took me a little while to get it, probably about 2 months to really, fully learn it. And but once you understand it, there's definitely a learning curve, and then you've got it. But the online version is a great option. And we'll include that in the links as well that we send out with all the resources. But they have quite a lot of lesson plans, resources for teachers on the free website. And I believe it's a relatively new website, the ArcGIS website. And you can go on there and look at different types of land use. You can zoom right into your community. They have a couple of cool map stories where you can actually find a picture from Google, and you can add it online and kind of make a map story that way, maybe write a little bit about it. So that's a fun activity you can do with students. So those are some ideas. And again, they have a lot of resources on their website about lesson plans and things. So hopefully you can use that in your classrooms, and it's a little bit easier. I actually, we'll provide you with a website that has a little bit more information for you about that.
And I think, Kathleen, there was suggestions. Darren started us off with some other, when you were talking about the wonderful golden horseshoe map that the Neptis Foundation came up with for the Greater Toronto area. Then Darren and others piped in with other maps for Los Angeles and other places. So I think, and when I copy the chat boxes, I've now promised to do, and include that as a file that we'll send to everybody tomorrow. You'll see some of those. But thank you, Joyce, and others for the suggestions you've already included here. This is great.
Absolutely, yes. A lot of times municipalities have data, and other organizations too, so that's great. Another
big question, Kathleen, it kind of comes back to the way you asked people to introduce themselves, which I thought was very good, about distinguishing between urban and rural areas. And of course, it's most of the discussions about complete communities, tend to be about, for those of us who live in big cities like Toronto, like Los Angeles. But if you're in a rural area, does the whole idea of complete communities apply there as well? Absolutely.
That's a great point, especially if you are in a rural community and you're wondering how this can apply. It might look different in a rural community. And there are probably some areas that aren't meant to have a lot of infill high density development. If you're in an agricultural community, for example, it's absolutely fine if it stays that way. That's often a good thing if it stays that way, because we're trying to protect those areas from urban development. So definitely want to kind of direct development to existing urban areas. That's the goal. But you can still, aim to have a complete community within rural areas. You still want to have green infrastructure. So things like, street trees and green roofs even. Mixed land use is a great way as well. So even if there is development going on within, a rural area, if there's, maybe a main street or something, encouraging mixed land use with shops and stores on the first floor, maybe a couple office space on the next floor, and residential, a couple apartments above that. And that's a great way of encouraging mixed land use, but still keeping it in a way that's keeping true to your community too. And you don't necessarily want to grow at the same rate of expansion, but you want to still have that sense of community and using the land wisely. Having a lot of single-story development doesn't really help that goal. And if we can encourage mixed land use and using the land sustainably, and again, trying to fit more within that little pocket of land, that's really what we want to encourage. I hope that's answered that question.
No, it's a great answer. Thank you. I'm just kind of scrolling back up through the chat box to see if I can see any other questions. Thank you, by the way, to Joyce for posting the SurveyMonkey survey in the chat box. That's a lot easier to copy than it will be from the screen. But okay, yeah, we'll definitely include a link to the depaving organizations as well. And so we still have a couple more minutes if you'd like to ask a question. And yes, rural communities also have a real struggle, as do poor urban communities, with things like food deserts and not having access to healthy food. And so it's, in some ways, there are some parallel struggles that that rural communities have as we urbanites do in making our communities more equitable and more complete.
Yes, and I just saw a question from Kristen. Do you have an idea about an activity to teach climate change for grade 6 to 8? We have quite a lot of ideas, and we have lesson plans online, as I mentioned. And we do have lesson plans that relate to climate change. It might say grade 8 or grade grade 10, but you can definitely adjust it to other classroom grades and ideas. So yeah, you can talk a little bit about bringing complete communities and how complete communities help address climate change, and you can also go through some of these activities, hopefully, and just shift the focus to more of a climate change aspect, and also talk about renewable resources and how it's really better to use those to, again, reduce climate change, and how you can incorporate those into a complete community.
And Kathleen, the other Kathleen on this webinar is asking you the question, have you seen ideas of how to incorporate any of this into preschool?
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, we talk a lot about, you can talk a little bit about communities and maybe look at maybe building complete communities, and you can talk about how it's great to have trees and the natural environment. Maybe you can talk about your students, they can think about their own homes and what type of home they live in. If there's some green space, maybe if there's a garden close by. If you ever take your class outside, you can talk about maybe, how there could be more trees, or if there are trees in a garden, you can talk about how great they are and how you want to encourage those and have more of those. You can also talk about how students get to school too. If they're in kindergarten, they maybe walk with their parents, maybe they're driven by their parents and dropped off. So you can maybe try and get students to think about maybe how they could move around their communities. So I know when they're that young, it's kind of not necessarily up to them, but just encouraging them to think about these kinds of things. And they can talk about it with their parents when they get home too. Hopefully that helps answer that a little bit. Again, showing images is a great way too, to kind of engage students. You can show them pictures of communities and different types of buildings. So maybe taller buildings and single detached homes, maybe townhomes, and talk about the community that they live in that way too.
Yeah, and I think Joyce drops in a lovely comment there about funding source here in Ontario. Okay. There's also, you want to, I think what I love about the presentation and the way in which you've described complete communities, Kathleen, is it's very invitational. It's very open-ended. It's everything from gardening, and there's, you may have to depave first, etc. But, there's so many aspects to complete communities that, you can follow your students' interests. You can pursue the options if you've got active, student or parent interests and opportunities for your particular school. You can work on that project for a year or two and then do a completely different one, and both of which will contribute to, building complete communities. So I think the comments that have just been asked, and I think you were absolutely right about the sensory activities for really young kids. All of this contributes in a broad sense to complete communities. And I think, as I added in a comment earlier, to me, what makes complete communities different than sustainable communities is a good term, but it's a little broad. And what we often miss are the details. We think we're building for sustainability, but we forget about pedestrians. Or as someone said earlier, when you put up a slide there, Kathleen, there was a slide of what looked like a complete community with pedestrians and low-rise buildings with retail on the ground floor, but there was, as Darren said, I don't see any bike lanes there. So each little piece contributes to it, but getting kids to think about what complete communities are is huge in and of itself, is hugely valuable, and is already equipping them with the skills to start thinking about how their own community can be better. So.
And I love to see all these ideas in the chat box as well. The sensory activities, that's a great idea to do with preschool students. So thanks for mentioning that. I love all these resources. Those are really useful, and I might incorporate them into my future presentations too. So thank you.
Absolutely. Kathleen, can you bring back the slide with the SurveyMonkey URL at the very end?
Okay.
There we go. Great. Well, Kathleen, you've done a fantastic job. What a great presentation. I'm so delighted that we didn't have too many technical hiccups. We did have one on the chat box, but I'll compensate by making sure that I capture the chat. I'm going to pause or stop the recording.